Vampire, Morta, Strigoi, Verkolka. These are just some of the names various cultures have bestowed upon the vampire, a belief as old as civilization itself. From earliest times, people have believed that the soul lives on long after a person dies, and in some cases, retains enough power to reactivate the body. To placate the dead, the living would bury food, drink, and concubines beside them. However, there was a fear among the living that the evil souls would be aroused from their graves in hopes of replenishment, a need that could only be filled through the revitalizing power of fresh blood. It was this fear that inspired ancient tales of vampire-like creatures. Among the earliest was the Babylonians' Adimu, a troubled soul that could not rest. The Adimu wandered the earth searching for victims whose veins it sucked. The ancient Hebrews feared a demon they called Lilitu. Legend held that Lilitu was the first wife of Adam, but was banished from the Garden of Eden after refusing to obey him. She became a demon who swept down to drink the blood of helpless infants and children. There are many such vampire-like creatures throughout early civilization. And of course, we're all familiar with the iconic vampires of Eastern Europe. However, what is so astounding about the vampire legend is that it transcends all cultures, all religions, and all regions of the world. Time has not dissipated the legend of the vampire. It has done the exact opposite. Today, the vampire is perhaps the most prolific and notorious figure throughout the world. This begs the question: if this legend has endured for so long and permeated so many cultures, can the stories of the vampire be real? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the vampire lives.
Well, it was about 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and I was out of cigarettes, so I thought I'd walk down to the store and get some. Well, my friend lived on this dirt road, which was about half a mile from the main road where the store was, so I had to walk. I'd only been walking about 5 minutes when this guy pulled up and asked if I needed a lift. He didn't look like a weirdo then. So I got in. As soon as I did, he locked all the doors and he started choking me. I must have passed out or something, because the next thing I knew, we were in this house. We weren't there very long before he started tearing my clothes off, and he raped me. It was awful. Then, he tied me up and he put tape on my eyes and my mouth so I couldn't see anything. Then I felt this pinching at my arm. It felt kind of like bee stings. I tried to move, but I couldn't. He told me to sit still. He said he was a vampire, and that he was gonna drain my blood through hypodermic needles. I thought this guy is a real sicko, and he's gonna kill me for sure. This went on for hours. Then it finally stopped, and he left after a while. Then I was able to throw myself out of a window and crawl to a neighbor's house for help. It was unbelievable what this man did to me.
After 22 hours of sheer terror, the naked and dazed woman hobbled down a dirt road until she flagged down a car for help. The self-proclaimed vampire, 39-year-old John Brennan Crutchley, had drank her blood from glass jars, robbing her of almost 1/3 of her blood. Crutchley, a computer engineer, is now serving time in a Florida jail where he is known to other inmates as Count Malabar. This is most certainly fact, not fiction. But is this man a real vampire? He is not immortal, nor does he turn into a bat or sleep in a coffin during the day. However, he does drink the blood of another living being. So what is the definition of a vampire in the 1990s? According to Stephen Kaplan, sociologist and director of the Vampire Research Center, alleged vampires fall into 3 categories. First, blood fetishists who are sexually aroused by blood. Second, vampire imitators who adopt vampire trappings in search of powers of domination, immortality, sensuality, and charisma. Third, true vampires. These people have a physical addiction to blood, drink it, believe it will prolong their lives, and find sexual satisfaction in the blood-drinking ritual. Kaplan has been researching vampires since 1972 and has published a vampire census since 1981. He believes that there are at least 50 true vampires living in the United States today. These vampires drink only a few ounces of human blood each day, but their need to drink it must be satisfied at any cost. They report that if they do not have this daily portion of blood, they become irritable, depressed, feel weak, and become very aggressive. With their constant daily need for human blood, this type of vampire will do almost anything to obtain it. They will take part in sadomasochistic rituals that include bloodletting and blood drinking. They will exchange sexual favors in return for blood. Many have joined blood cults in order to satisfy their needs. Kaplan says that he's never met a vampire of this type who would kill for blood. They say the amount of blood needed does not warrant killing the donor. But if there's no alternative, some will take blood from an unwilling donor. You see, vampires do exist. They may not sleep in coffins or turn into bats, but they do drink blood. Some do it by biting their partner. Others use needles or sharp objects. The methods may vary, but the objective is the same.
I've known Steve for a long time now, and we've been getting together for quite a few years. Usually my husband's there, and if I can find another donor, then I'll invite them along too. I'll dim the lights, put on some soft music, light a few candles. Steve usually likes to lay on the couch, and I'll kneel beside him. And I start by massaging his back and his shoulders until he feels comfortable and relaxed. And then after a while, I'll gently take his hand and slowly lick his fingertips. And with a sterilized hypodermic, I'll prick his finger until blood starts to drip from it. And then I'll squeeze and then suck. And then squeeze again and suck some more. And I do this until I've satisfied my hunger.
The vampire, Pam, says she was born a vampire, that vampirism ran in her family, with only 1 or 2 per generation. She claims that as an infant, she kept biting herself until she bled. When she was growing up, other school children teased her about her pale coloring. Bright sunlight hurt her eyes, and today she must wear sunglasses during the daylight. While these vampire characteristics may sound silly, her need for blood is a serious matter.
I need about a cup of blood per week in the winter and about a pint of blood per week in the summer. I don't get high on blood, I just feel energized and satisfied. Sometimes donors are pretty hard to find. And when the hunger gets really bad, I start climbing the walls. When I'm going out to find someone, I usually wait until the right time to bring it up. I might start talking about the movies, the occult, sexual fantasies, and then working into the conversation when I feel like the time is right. I don't force anybody to do anything they don't want to do, but once the person gets to know me a little better, I'm usually able to convince them.
Many of these vampires typically trade sex for blood and look for donors that are willing to be bitten, cut, or pricked while in the throes of lovemaking. One such vampire claims her technique doesn't even hurt.
To me, vampirism and sex, kind of like peanut butter and jelly. They're so good together. You just want to eat it up. I guess I've been exchanging blood for sex for 10 years now. I really rather enjoy it. And so do my partners. You see, I take blood in a very pleasurable, not painful way. And I always take it from a part of the body that doesn't show, so it doesn't show any marks. I usually use a hypodermic needle or a razor blade. And I always wait till the very right moment. And then I do my thing. It does heighten my partner's pleasure, and I must admit that I do love it. Oh, and sometimes I take the razor and make little slashes across the body. The chest is the best. The butt's too fleshy and it doesn't bleed very easily. But when the blood begins to ooze, I slowly, gently start to lick it up until it stops bleeding. It's a sensation that's kind of hard to explain. Oh, but it is very pleasurable for both of us.
The need for blood is very real for these modern vampires. They feel it revitalizes, gives them strength, and perpetuates a self-image of sensuality and control. Characteristics that are the outgrowth of the vampire legends that have been with us for centuries. Since the dawning of civilization, vampires have lurked behind a shroud of religion and superstition, and to this day walk among us. In fact, as you've just seen, there are human beings who find that they cannot resist the compulsion to draw and drink the blood of others, or in some cases, their own blood. Unlike the archetypal vampire who we most associate with the character of Count Dracula, these vampires do not have eternal life, nor do they have large fangs for teeth, and in most cases do not sleep in coffins or have Eastern European accents. These true human vampires are as individualistic as the rest of us. They are young and old, male and female, and of various ethnic backgrounds. Some are harmless, but some are extremely dangerous. Although it is rare, some of these human vampires have engaged in activities far more horrible than anything ever depicted in folklore, literature, or movies. You see, man's actual capacity for evil far surpasses any imaginary evils concocted at the hand of a writer. To understand the psyche of these real vampires, we must first grasp the legend of the vampire and how this creature has become a part of our culture. Vampire-like creatures have been documented through carvings, drawings, and other artifacts well before the time of Christ. Ironically, with the advent of Christianity, vampirism and the belief of the undead rising from the grave seemed to grow stronger. Christian writers mixed ancient pagan myths with church doctrine about purgatory. These writings tell of excommunicated people leaving their graves because their souls could not find peace. But perhaps one of the strongest underlying links to the mystique of the vampire was the church's teachings regarding the regenerative power of blood. These teachings stem from the familiar words of the Old Testament and the gathering of Jesus' disciples at the Last Supper.
Take this, all of you, and drink from it. For this is the cup of my blood, the blood of the new and everlasting covenant. Do this in memory of me.
These sacred acts were emulated through the transubstantiation of Christ's body and blood, which were consumed by worshipers at Mass. This act reinforced the widely held belief in the regenerative power of blood. As Christianity spread throughout Europe, tales of vampire attacks became more frequent. In 1486, a church-sanctioned book called The Witch Hammer described approved procedures for identifying and punishing vampires. They were to be disinterred and decapitated. The religious fervor of the mass population probably only aided the spread of vampire tales. Without the knowledge of modern science and medicine, these people felt that the forces of good and evil were the causes of all things. By the 16th and 17th century, reports of vampires were centered around the Slavic regions of Eastern Europe, lands now situated in Hungary and Romania. Within this territory was the independent state of Transylvania, the home of the fictitious Count Dracula. Transylvania was a remote land where armies fought mightily and nobles built gloomy castles upon the craggy slopes of the Carpathian mountain foothills. For natives and foreigners alike, it has always seemed a mysterious place. The heavily forested country was at the time inhabited by superstitious peasants who eked out a hard living from the soil and relied on their religion and superstitions for guidance. A character in Bram Stoker's Dracula explained some of the reasons for the richness of the area's folklore.
In the population of Transylvania, there are 4 distinct nationalities. Saxons in the south and mixed with them Romanians, who are descendants of Dacians, Magyars in the west, and Zikels in the west and north. I read that every known superstition in the world is gathered in the horseshoe of the Carpathians, as if it were the center of some sort of imaginative whirlpool.
This remote, mystical land also faced very hard times. The possibility of famine, flood, drought, or plagues was a constant worry. And when they did occur, the peasants often blamed evil supernatural forces, usually vampires. The plagues of the 16th century amplified the belief of vampires, and many prominent officials directly attributed plagues to vampires. Many believed that vampires brought with them an awful stench that heralded the coming of a plague. During these plague-ridden years, terrified people buried the stricken immediately after they died. Sometimes in their haste, they buried people before they had died, when they were in coma-like state. Occasionally, these unfortunate victims would awaken in their graves or in the morgue, and bystanders would shriek in horror as they witnessed what they thought was the birth of a vampire. Folklore identifies a vampire as an individual who has risen from the grave in search of fresh blood to prolong the life of its evil spirit. These are basically the same vampire characteristics we know today. However, there are definite differences between the vampire folklore and the vampire of classic fiction. Also known as revenants, the folkloric vampire usually visited its victim in the form of a dream or nightmare where it sucked the lifeblood from its victim. The revenant might also be seen wandering the town, day or night, causing disturbances and panic among the residents. Unlike the tall, elegant, Dracula-esque figure we all know, the revenant was described as a peasant with a face ruddy and swollen, long fingernails, and a general unpleasant appearance. The nightmarish dreams involving the revenant and his supposed sightings were usually followed by a number of sudden and unexplained deaths. Perhaps the result of some contagious disease, but nonetheless blamed on the revenant who had already been sighted. The only way to stop the deaths, it was believed, was to kill the vampire and all others who had been killed by the vampire. If the others were not also killed, they too would return as vampires. This belief that vampirism may increase by geometric proportions if the vampire was not disposed of correctly was used to explain the epidemics of the plague. For the people of this era, it was vampirism that was contagious, not the plague. By the 18th century, vampirism was becoming a popular subject, and its truths were debated among many scholars and writers. In 1732, the word vampire first appeared in the Oxford English Dictionary, and 14 books were published on the subject in Germany alone. It was during this period that official documentation began to appear regarding vampirism in parts of Serbia and Wallachia, which were under the control of Austria. The occupying forces began to notice and file reports on a peculiar local practice, exhuming bodies and killing them. Literate outsiders attended these curious and horrific exhumations. For these educated Europeans, the local vampire craze became a media event that was written about and spread throughout Europe. Identifying and killing vampires became a common occurrence in Eastern Europe, and many of these practices survived until they were outlawed in the early 20th century. Because of the official government and church documents, we know these practices took place, and many were spelled out in vivid detail. One account that occurred in 1725 was very typical of what these officials saw. This incident involved a Serbian peasant named Peter Plagojevich in the village of Kisilova. The subsequent events were recorded by Austrian military officials who were there to administer its government. Our subject, Peter Plagojevich, had died 10 weeks past. He'd been buried according to local custom. It was revealed that in the same village, during a period of a week, 9 people had also died after suffering a 24-hour illness. Each of them had publicly declared that while they were still alive but on their deathbed, Plagojevich had come to them in their sleep and throttled the life out of them. To this end, the townspeople went to the government official as well as the local priest and demanded that the grave of Plagojevich be opened to see if he was a vampire. At first, the officials refused, but the villagers informed them that if they did not accord them a legal viewing, they would be forced to abandon their village. Following is the Austrian officials' written account of the disinterment of Mr. Plagojevich.
Since I could not hold these people from their resolution, myself and the local priest witnessed the disinterment of the body. I did not detect the slightest odor that is otherwise characteristic of the dead, and the body, except for the nose which had fallen away, was completely fresh. The hair and beard, even the nails of which the old ones had fallen away, had grown on him. The old skin, which was somewhat whitish, had peeled away, and a new one had emerged from it. Not without astonishment, I saw fresh blood in his mouth, which, according to the common observation, he had sucked from the people killed by him. With great speed, the outraged subject sharpened a stake and pierced his chest, whereupon, as he was pierced, much blood, completely fresh, flowed from his nose, ears, and mouth, as well as other signs which I passed by out of high respect. Finally, according to their usual practice, he was burned to ashes.
Appearance, identification, and killing of a vampire became a by-the-book task. The primary signs were, of course, the sightings of the revenant, followed by the sudden deaths of various townfolk. Once the accused vampire was disinterred, there were numerous telltale signs: the freshness of the body, blood around the mouth, plumpness of the body, which was assumed to be caused by drinking too much blood. The vampire was killed by driving a stake through the heart and then burned. In some regions, the bodies were also decapitated or the heart cut out. It was also assumed that those who were killed by the vampire also became vampires, so those bodies were treated in a similar manner. In the minds of the people of this era, it was vampirism that was contagious, not the bacteria and viruses that caused these plagues. Of course, in their day, they did not have the knowledge of modern medicine, and vampirism seemed like a more plausible cause. there were a number of other vampire killings that captured the headlines of the day. One such incident in 1732 involved a former military officer named Arnold Payol. Payol was a young man, and after his military service had returned to his hometown Medwegna, near Belgrade, Yugoslavia. He settled down, bought a cottage and 2 acres of land, and married the daughter of a rich neighboring farmer. Although Payol was always cordial, he seemed to be a troubled soul. He confided to his wife that during his military service, he'd been visited by an undead being, and this had caused him much grief. For a time, it seemed that Payol had escaped the effects of this vampire. Then, during harvest time, he fell from a hay wagon and was killed. About 1 month later, rumors began to circulate in the village that Payol had been seen wandering around after nightfall. People complained that he haunted them, and several had died. Word of these incidents spread quickly, and soon the townspeople decided to exhume Payol's body. The event stirred official interest, so that the party was accompanied by an Austrian Imperial Committee of Inquiry, 3 army surgeons, a lieutenant colonel, and a sub-lieutenant.
The disinterment of Mr. Arnold Payol found that he was quite complete and undecayed. The corpse had moved to one side, the jaws gaped wide open, and the blue lips were moist with new blood which trickled in a thin stream from the mouth as well as the eyes, nose, and ears. The shirt, the covering, and the coffin were completely bloody. The old nails on his hands and feet along with the skin had fallen away, and new ones had grown back. And since they saw from this that he was a true vampire, they drove a stake through his heart, whereby he gave an audible groan and bled conspicuously. Thereupon, the same day, they burned the body to ashes and threw these into the grave. These people said further that all those who were tormented and killed by the vampires must themselves become vampires. Therefore, they disinterred the 4 people in the same way.
These documented accounts prove that the fear of vampires among most Eastern Europeans was very real. It was so out of control that in 1755, Maria Theresa, the Archduchess of Austria and Queen of Hungary, issued a decree condemning the vampire hunts and desecration of graves. But even her decree could not defeat age-old fears. Vampire hunts continued, albeit more discreetly. As recently as 1912, Hungarian farmers dealt with the corpse of a suspected vampire in the time-honored and outlawed fashion. The fear and hysteria was undeniable. But were these vampires for real? We'll probably never know for sure. There is no doubt, however, that a misunderstanding of death and disease combined with uncontrollable superstitions made the vampire more believable. Among the cultures of this day, death was contagious, and it was meaningful and deliberate. Death's patterns were based on values and vendettas, not plague-ridden rats. To these people, death came from the dead, who through jealousy or anger sought to bring the living into their realm. To prevent this, the living attempted to neutralize the power of the dead. As you have heard, they did this through very specific means. This whole phenomenon is hard for us to believe. But had we lived during a time where superstition far overshadowed medicine and plagues suddenly appeared and disappeared, we too might have believed in evil forces rising from the grave. The The beliefs and practices these people concocted to protect themselves were just the beginning of a vampire mystique that has become a permanent part of our culture.
Good evening. Won't you please come in?
These inviting but positively sinister words have lured us all into a world of sensuality, lust, and power. The world of the vampire. The classical vampire of fiction embodied by Bram Stoker's character, Count Dracula. Unlike our peasant revenant, this sleekly handsome vampire carries an air of nobility, an aristocratic mystique that hides the evil within his soul. Over the past century, this is the vampire that has evolved in literature, film, and television. This is the vampire we fear and the vampire we love. The alluring romantic, the powerful masculine figure, the master of everlasting life and the victim of evil immortality. In sharp contrast to our revenant of peasant heritage, this well-bred vampire evokes passion and sexuality. We find that most of his subordinates are women, and his attacks usually have a pronounced sexual component. He is magnetic, irresistible, and deliberate in his movements, as though he knows that the lady really wants it this way. The implicit sexuality suggests that while he attacks men as well, he seldom does so in close-up, and both location and pace are apt to differ. For example, women are attacked in their boudoir in a leisurely manner. Men in some dark, dangerous place, and the act is violent and quick. Through literature and later films, the modern vampire has grown and evolved as a character. He has become more than a demon. He has become a complex character, more fitting of a mortal human. He has become one of us. One of today's most popular authors of vampire books, Anne Rice, has created a character that transcends the genre. In her book, Interview with a Vampire, the character of Lestat is far from being a mysterious, evil presence in the background. Here, he is actually the narrator of the story, and we see the vampire agonizing over his condition. The humanization of the vampire character has probably broadened his appeal. However, the unequivocal classic is without a doubt Bram Stoker's Dracula. But even Stoker's Dracula was molded around other fictional vampires that captured the imagination of the world. Dracula and others like him were part of the Gothic literature of the 18th and 19th century that gave us the characteristics of the vampire we all know. The tall, handsome nobleman, the irresistible appeal, the paralyzing stare, and the power of immortality. He feared only the light of day and religious symbols such as the cross and holy water. His final death would come only at sunup with a stake through the heart. This modern vampire first came to life on the pages of The Vampire by Dr. John Polidori. Polidori was the personal physician of one of the most influential literary figures of the day, the poet Lord Byron. Polidori and Lord Byron were also traveling companions. And one summer holiday, the two traveled to Europe with a man named Percy Shelley and his wife Mary Shelley. To relieve the boredom of a rainy week, Byron proposed that each member of the party write a horror story. From this suggestion, Byron sketched plans for a vampire tale. However, Byron never finished it. Instead, Polidori picked up the idea and wrote The Vampire. Mary Shelley also sketched plans for a tale of her own, a famous one in its own right. It was called Frankenstein. This strange twist of fate produced two of the century's most infamous Gothic novels. Polidori's character in The Vampire, the Englishman Lord Ruthven, laid the foundation for the aristocratic vampire we know today. Although Lord Ruthven dresses, speaks, and acts like those around him, there is something mysterious and dangerously threatening about him. Like the literary vampires that followed him, he is repulsive and attractive at the same time.
In spite of the deadly hue of his face, which never gained a warmer tint, either from the blush of modesty or from the strong emotion of passion, though its form and outline were beautiful, many of the female hunters after notoriety attempted to win his attention.
The characteristics of Polidori's vampire, his sexuality, appearance, and psychological manipulation, became the trademarks of the vampire's mystique. During the Victorian era, other vampire books were written. Varney the Vampire, The Feast of Blood, took a sensationalistic approach to the subject and was the first to capture the attention of the masses. Published in installments, the covers combined horror with lurid sex and coined the term penny dreadful novel, kind of a soft porn novel for the 1800s. This 868-page tale firmly planted the staples of vampire lore in the minds of enthusiastic readers. Readers were primed for more, and the stage was set for Bram Stoker's Dracula. First published in 1897, the novel was instantly popular and has never been out of print. Stoker, an Irishman, cleverly focused the vampire legend and set it firmly in Transylvania. He incorporated the characteristics of past fictional vampires and added a few of his own. Stoker was the first to create a vampire that was able to transform into a bat. Once again, repressed Victorian readers latched on to the overtly sensual overtones in Stoker's book. The mesmerizing stare, the fatal seduction. The power of Count Dracula defined an entire genre, but his evil power paled in comparison to the real Count Dracula.